Hi everyone, Mark Metternich here, and to keep up the freebies, I just wanted to make a very quick, very basic and short tutorial about the very basics of color space. This is going to leave most questions unanswered, but for those who have not dove into color spaces and how they work, you may really enjoy this. But before I do that, I'd like to remind you of Master Printer Robert B. Park and my free episodes of Print Talk, Ultimate Printing on YouTube, where we have many wonderful cameo appearances by wonderful photographers coming on board to talk about all things printmaking. I apologize for the bad audio. I've been on the road for almost 4 months now, and I do not have my professional microphone, but I want to keep up the freebies for everyone who is on my mailing list. So I decided, because so many people get a lot out of this when I teach this in my workshops, to go ahead and make this for everyone who's on my mailing list for free. Enjoy. Now I know that color space freaks out some people. It can get very complicated. We're not going to go into the complexities, but let's talk about those 3 generic color spaces, what color space is, and I believe this will help you very much to visualize how this works and how color space choice and controlling your colors in Lightroom, Camera Raw, Photoshop is very important. So let's start out with Srgb. That's what you're seeing right here. At the top, you've got lighter and lighter colors to the point where you reach pure white. At the bottom, you have darker and darker colors reaching the point of pure black. And you also have your red, your blue, and your green, your RGB, red, green, blue, red, green, and on this side over here, your blue. And all your mixtures of all your other colors being represented here in a 3-dimensional plot. So the way you read this is all of these colors as they go up higher, they get lighter. All of the colors as they go lower, they get darker. The farther that they stick out, the more saturated those colors can become, even though this gamut plot looks quite saturated on my monitor. It's just showing you that the farther that these little points go outward, the more saturated or the less saturated these colors can become. Now, also think of it this way. It's not just about saturation. If you have a color space and you have weak greens, and then you have another color space that has really wide saturated greens, those greens also interact with all of the colors in the spectrum to create much more color variation. So wider gamuts don't only mean more saturated colors, but they also mean massive amounts of subtle variations of colors, more variations. So Srgb was made for the web. It is a narrow color space. And we can look at it and it's interesting, but doesn't really mean much until we actually compare it to something else. So I will just put it right here. And let's go ahead and click on the next color space, which is Adobe Rgb 1998. This is a wide color gamut, and in many cases is a preferred color gamut to use for processing your photos, which we will talk just a little bit about. But watch what happens when I click on Adobe Rgb. I will go back to Srgb. Let's put it right here so you can see it better. Adobe Rgb. It is a much, much wider color gamut. I'll put it right here. Srgb. And now go to Adobe. Now you will look and see that in the blue area, Srgb and Adobe RGB are really not much different. But in other areas, I'll put these all out right about here so you can see them. Now go to Srgb. Huge, huge difference. Look at all of these greens, all of these colors right in here, all of these colors right in here, the darker ones, the lighter ones. There's a gigantic difference between Srgb, it's all shaved off, and Adobe RGB. Now here's another way to visualize this. Let's go ahead and lock down Adobe RGB, and then let's click on Srgb, and now you're seeing Srgb inside of the Adobe RGB space. Do you see this massive area of colors, variations, and saturation all throughout your reds, your yellows, your greens, massively into your greens and your green blues? It's just a big, gigantic difference you can see here. Now down here near the black areas that have just a touch of magenta or blue, they are basically identical. But look at all of these colors that are in Adobe RGB that are not in Srgb. Again, this plot here looks very saturated. It doesn't give you accurate colors. This is a visualization, but what you can see is that Adobe RGB has massive, massive, massive more colors all throughout this spectrum, even into these yellows and reds and oranges. Even it goes way out past red. Gigantic difference. Now, let's go ahead and go back to Adobe RGB. Very good color space to work in. It does have some deficiencies in it, but it's pretty good. Now what I want to show you is Srgb again. So here's your Srgb space. And let's go ahead and put it like somewhere like right here. You can see red, your green, the blues are going to be over here. But let's just go right here for a second. There. Now watch this. Pro Photo RGB, which most people advocate as the best color space in the world to work in, which I do not advocate for, but you can use it if you know how to professionally control color very, very well. Watch this difference. Here's Pro Photo. Boom. What in the world? This has gone off the charts. What does that mean? What this is basically showing you is that a large part of the Pro Photo RGB space is in the stratosphere zone of colors that the eyeball cannot even see. Printers can't print, monitors can't see, your eyeballs cannot see a high percentage of colors. But this encapsulates basically almost all the color that your sensor in your camera is able to capture. The problem is our eyes can't see a big chunk of it, and they never will be able to, even if they could print it. But this space is massive. Let's compare it again to Srgb. Interesting. Let's go ahead and go right here. Pro Photo RGB, boom. Gosh, that thing is massive. Now, that does not mean that if you work in Pro Photo RGB that you necessarily have to push your colors that saturated. The danger lies in the fact that we can be working on our photos and bringing our saturation up, and on our displays, especially Srgb monitors like Mac monitors, Even Adobe RGB displays, the wide gamut displays, can't show you these colors. And you could be pushing your colors into the twilight zone and your monitor can't show it to you when you're in this space. Then what happens is when you go and you make a print or even try to make a sRGB image for the web, you're going to have sometimes massive clipping problems. What is clipping? Clipping is when you've pushed your colors into this type of zone, even outside the ability to even see with the human eye, but they have to get remapped into a space like this. And the farther out that you push those colors from the space it's actually going into, the more problems you're going to have, because the more unlike the space they are. Now, does that make sense? If you push colors way outside the saturation levels, the color variation, the different types of colors, even into the synthetic zone where the colors are beyond the ability to even see, and then you have to put them in sRGB or Adobe RGB, or you send them to print, and you find out that the paper and the machine that you use prints an even narrower color gamut than maybe even sRGB. What happens? All those colors have to get remapped. Now, if these colors are just a little bit outside your printer and paper space, it's not really much of a problem to remap them. The software can do that very well. But the farther and the more they go out, the bigger the problems are. A good example is Aurora Borealis. You get colors hitting your sensor that are outside the ability of the human eye to see, but they're there and our cameras can register them. And if you capture them in Pro Photo Rgb and then you make a print, sometimes you have massive shifts in color. Even to the point where some of your greens will get brownish or yellowish and blotchy and banding and things like that. So, learning how to know what color space you're in and knowing what outputs, like what are you going to do with your photos? Are you going to print them at Costco? Are you going to make a Luma Chrome print out of Nevada art printers? That proprietary super gloss photo paper that Robert Park innovated that is now the best super gloss photo paper in the world? Are you going to make a Fuji Flex print? A metal print? What colors are you outputting to? Are you going to output just for display? Most people are on sRGB monitors today. That's really the question. And also, what are the future uses of that photo file that you are working on in post-processing? Are you going to eventually print it on a wider gamut? There's a lot to consider here, but let me show you something. Let's just say, hypothetically, that you're working in Adobe Rgb. Very good color space. Say you have an image that has a lot of color variation. It's a pretty saturated scene. You process the image and it looks perfect on a wide gamut monitor or maybe even a sRGB monitor. It looks really great. And you send it into print. Well, let me go ahead and just hold this for comparison and show you a couple of things that may be alarming. Now, long time ago, I used to make my portfolio pieces from Costco glossy paper. Let me click on that for a second. Holy smokes. Do you see the inner color space and how massive the outer one is? The inner one is the actual color space for that super gloss laser print at Costco. So if I'm working in Adobe Rgb and I'm pushing my saturation levels up to the point where they're maxing out, but not to the point where they're looking bad, but you're just getting maximum color saturation, and I have an image that might have a lot of colors in it, can you imagine how horrible that these images have to be pulled back to get into the color space of that Costco print? Just look at the greens. These greens are nuclear stratospheric in Adobe Rgb compared to a Costco print. So what does that mean? You're going to have problems in your greens, period. If you have been processing your image into a nice saturation that's out here, but then you make a Costco print The software has to pull all of that back into this zone, and then what happens is you get all of these variations of green mixed with other colors wrapped all the way around here, blue, greens, yellow, greens, all of these different greens and blues. They are going to end up becoming like one type of green, and it's going to be very limited. That is shocking. I'm going to show you another thing that's shocking. For years, until I started doing this professionally for galleries many years back, a lab told me, hey, send your stuff in Adobe Rgb. We print Adobe Rgb. And they would tell me that Fuji Flex prints Adobe Rgb. Or I'd say, hey, I want a Fuji Flex. They'd be printing it off of a Chromera, a Lambda, or a Lightjet. And they would say, we print Adobe Rgb. Okay, let's test that one out. Let's go ahead and let's go to Adobe Rgb. Here's Adobe Rgb. And let's just go ahead and use one of the Fuji Flex and see what happens. I used to use Fuji Flex being printed off of the Chromera, which was the newest laser technology. Let's click on this one. This was one from a lab that I used to use long time ago. Holy smokes. Adobe Rgb is this one. And Fuji Flex is on the inside. Now check out a couple of things here. Do you see where it's dark? I'll show you right there. See that dark stuff? This is where Adobe Rgb is not even wide enough to print these blues. So the Adobe Rgb space is not even wide enough for the Fuji Flex print. The Fuji Flex print can go wider. The Fuji Flex print can also go wider in this area. But Adobe Rgb extremely exceeds Fuji Flex and its ability to be printed off the Chromera in those areas where it's sticking out way out here. And if you've processed your photo and you've pushed your colors to the point where they look their very best and you have a fairly saturated image with a lot of colors, do you see how much pulling back or clipping these photos are they're just gonna get chopped off, and they're gonna be put into the space that you see in here because that printer can't print those colors. It's impossible. That is very interesting. It's freaky. I learned this very quick, and I began to study color management intensely as I was doing post-processing for gallery photographers, and started learning how to control my colors so that I never went outside the space of the printer output that we would be going for. But that is remarkable. Sorry about the sound change here. I've been asked to show everyone how incredibly absurd the Pro Photo RGB space is in comparison to the popular chromogenic prints. Chromogenic meaning the papers are subjected to lasers and the paper is actually changing color instead of pigment prints, like inkjet. And again, we've already looked at Chromera Flex, Fuji Flex. We've looked at other chromogenic prints. So this is Fuji Flex from another company, Fuji Silk, Fuji Pearl, Fuji Maxima, and Fuji Crystal Archive. Not Flex Crystal Archive, but Fuji Crystal Archive. I've been asked a lot of questions about Fuji Maxima, sort of marketed as this phenomenal new photo paper with this ultra wide color gamut. Well, it's compared to your standard generic Crystal Archive, and it's really a little bit bigger, but nothing to call home to mom about. But these are all your chromogenic prints, Fuji Flex being my very favorite outside of Luma Chrome because of that super gloss, no texture, 3D look that Luma Chrome takes to a whole nother other place. But check this out. I'm going to go ahead and just take one of these. Like, let's go ahead and go with the Maxima, the widest gamut of Fuji's chromogenic prints. And I'm going to tilt this up, and let's see. I'll put red over to the left, green up above. Let's just start with this. Now watch Pro Photo RGB. Boom. I mean, seriously, are you kidding me? Look how massive Prophoto Rgb is. So let's hold this. There's your pearl inside of Prophoto. Here is your maxima inside of Prophoto. It's not very maxima. And here is your standard crystal archive. And by the way, here is the maxima, here is the crystal archive, here is the pearl, maxima. They're really almost identical. But look at how massive. I mean, that is just incalculable. You can't even show you here how far these colors go out. So let's look at the green zone, all right? It's, I can't even show it to you. Because when I bring it in too much, you can't see. You get a feel for it though. See, here comes your green corner right here, going up and out. It is out. How about your yellows? They're out. How about your reds? Way out. Cyan, magenta, purple, everything. It is unbelievable. So, can you just look at this for a moment and understand why, if people are processing in Prophoto Rgb, and they're getting all of their colors looking just right, the color variations. Remember, it's not just about insane saturation levels, but it has to do with color variations, all of these colors mixing. And this image that you see here, even though green looks really saturated, red looks saturated, etc., this is just a not perfect representation so that you can visualize. But these colors are different colors as they go way out here. So you're processing in this gigantic space, and then what happens is you send it to any one of those chromogenic prints, and are you going to have some problems maybe? Unless you're photographing snow, which is white, or something that's just simply gray. But if you get into colorful photos to any extent, of any color, I mean, look how far out reds can go. I remember when I first ran into this problem and we were trying to print in a gallery perfect blood red lava rolling out of a volcano, and no matter how much we turned up the saturation, no matter how much we hue shifted it, it looked brownish. We could not get that super ultra red. Well, makes sense. Look how weak the reds are in chromogenic prints. That just doesn't look all that red to me. So that is one of those things you have to be kind of looking out for. Look how weak the greens are too. The greens aren't going way out here into Prophoto. Blues seem to be pretty good. This blue, purple, magenta seems to be pretty good for the chromogenic prints, but all the other areas just are going to be super, super deficient. Let's go ahead and go to White Wall's current Fuji Pearl. I expect this to be a canned profile, not a custom profile, but that is Fuji Pearl. Here is Fuji Maxima. That is that whitest Gamut print, not the super gloss though. I prefer the super gloss far more than I do that print paper. But look at that, and that's Adobe Rgb. But there are some places where it's going outside of Adobe Rgb. So what ideally you want to do is you want to choose a color space that is going to encompass all the colors that your printer can print, but also learn how to soft proof and use the gamut warning in Photoshop so that you know you're not pushing colors outside the boundaries of what can actually be printed when you are making masterful prints. That is a craftsmanship, that is a complex skill, and I'm going to address this in a more intermediate and advanced way in my new video tutorials coming out about mastering fine art printmaking and color management, the whole new series, as well as the ultimate sharpening workflow for fine art printmaking that's going to be completely redone. And I'm going to show people all the ins and outs of color management. Let me show you one more thing. This is my preferred color space today. If you want that color space, I will have that on my website, markmetternich.com. But here's BETA RGB. Now, BETA RGB is a wide color gamut, and it's also very well rounded. When we say that, that means greens go way out, yellows go way out, reds go way out, magentas, blues, everything goes way out. And it's a very full color space. In fact, let's look at this compared to Adobe RGB. See, Adobe RGB, BETA. But it does not have all of those synthetic colors, colors that are outside of human vision that we're never ever going to see, like a Pro Photo RGB space. And I'll show you that right there. Boom. This is massive. Compare that to BETA. BETA's gotten quite small. But what's really cool about this is it doesn't have those synthetic colors, but it does have a larger color space than probably any print you can make today. And my favorite photo paper in the world is Luma Chrome. Here is the Spectrum Luma Chrome. Look at that. Woo-wee! That is the best fit I have ever seen, and that is actually the widest gamut print that I have ever seen. Now there is just a very, very, very slight amount of a kind of a blue-green right here, but it's so slight it is completely irrelevant. So let's go to Adobe RGB for a second. So Adobe RGB is on the inside and Luma Chrome is on the outside, and Adobe is not going to give us the full amount of colors or color variation. Again, remember, it's not just about how saturated colors are, it's about the variations of colors. There's all kinds of variations when you take these colors to lighter or to darker and you mix them with all the other colors. This is only a representation. It just gives you an idea of what we're dealing with. But when we go to BETA, they are almost identical. So here's BETA RGB, hold for comparison, and here is Luma Chrome. That is the best match you'll ever see. Pro Photo will go way, way, way outside the spectrum. And it is easy to clip colors, to take them way too far, and then when they get printed in that other color space, you often can have moderate to very severe problems in color shifting and blotchiness and lack of variation. Now let's go ahead and undo the comparison, and let's go to my second favorite paper in the world. That's Fuji Flex. That is Fuji Flex right there. And it's kind of a surprise to some people how Fuji Flex's color gamut is really not as wide as people often think. It's just not quite as wide. Here is Fuji Flex printed off of the Chimera. It's almost the same. This is Fuji Flex printed off of a Lightjet, I believe. It's almost the same. Very, very, very close. Fuji Flex is my second favorite. Luma Chrome HD prints out of Nevada art printers are the highest quality supergloss photo paper prints in the world, acrylic mounts. But again, I'm going to go to this one, almost identical. So it's surprising. Let's look at this, but let's go ahead and let's go to BETA RGB, my preferred color space. Let's hold it for comparison, and then let's go ahead and go to Fuji Flex print. And all of the Fuji Flex is inside the BETA RGB. You could pretty much ignore that, and I believe this little bit right here, I don't know if I trust that or not, that little bit of blue. So that's what you're looking at. So if I'm in BETA RGB and I'm going to make Fuji Flex prints, the good thing about BETA RGB is it has all of the colors that are in the Fuji Flex, but it has a lot more. It doesn't have those crazy synthetic colors as Pro Photo RGB, so I'm not going to go into the twilight zone and have massive clipping problems, but I do need to know how to control my colors and my saturation as I'm working in RAW and in Photoshop. And mastering gamut warning while you're working on photos is a great idea. Another idea is learning how to work in raw smart object layers, so your layers are actually raw. They're in that 32-bit superior math space that's lossless in quality. You can change the color space in a raw layer in Photoshop, raw smart object layer, and you can create layers, bring up your saturation, and let's just say maybe your greens are starting to clip. The gamut warning is showing that to you when you use that. There's ways to mask just those greens and pull those greens back as everything else expands a little bit more. So basically you stay in the space of the print that you're going to make even though you're in this wider gamut. That is going to be in my new video tutorial about mastering printmaking, and maybe a bit of it might be also in my ultimate sharpening workflow for fine art printmaking. The brand new one might have a slightly different title. You guys look out for it. If you want general recommendations, if you're not going to use BETA RGB as your color space, I would advocate for Adobe. It's plenty wide for most things. Word of warning, before you send your image into be printed, using any lab except for a high-end custom lab like Nevada art printers, you're going to have to put your image into the color space that they recommend before you send it to them, because they're probably going to scratch their head and say, what is BETA RGB? Most printers, most generic print houses, even with the big names, do not deal with color ideally. And often their software will just simply kick out a weird color space or convert it into Adobe RGB or Srgb or what have you. Anyway, hopefully that's helpful. Adobe RGB, BETA RGB, Pro Photo RGB, Luma Chrome. Looks so small compared to Pro Photo, but you know what the problem is? Pro Photo is so wide, it goes into colors that don't even exist in our eyeballs. We can't see it. Luma Chrome encompasses just about everything that the human eye can see. Very wide gamut, very well-rounded, really a totally amazing development in photo paper. And as you can see, compared to even Fuji Flex, the best super gloss photo paper in the world before Luma Chrome, look how narrow the color gamut is in Fuji Flex. It's unbelievable to me when I first saw this. Hopefully that didn't confuse you more than it did enlighten you, but for much more information, much more clarification, either join the Ultimate Fine Art Printmaking Workshop. It's annual in March with Robert B. Park, master print guru of gurus, and myself. About 25 hours of curriculum, Saturday, Sunday, and a half day on Monday for all practical application. All the best to you, and great light to you.